High school, for most of us, it's just a given, right? A fundamental part of growing up. But this institution we all know so well, it didn't just pop up out of nowhere. Oh no. It was actually forged over centuries of debate, conflict, and some pretty big ideas. Today, we're going to trace that incredible journey and answer the question, how did the American high school evolve into what it is today? Okay, so to get this, let's start with a really simple question. Before there were lockers and pep rallies and prom, what did education even look like for young Americans? Where did they learn? Well, for most people back in the colonial era, learning wasn't about sitting in a classroom. Not at all. Education was just woven into the fabric of everyday life. You had some kids learning basic reading from a local woman in her home. They called them dame schools. For boys, a common path was an apprenticeship, learning a trade from a master. And for pretty much everyone, education was deeply, deeply tied to religion, mostly about learning to read the Bible. So formal high school, it just wasn't a thing. But that informal system, it started to change. The first formal secondary schools began to appear. Now, if you're picturing your local public high, you got to think again. These were more like exclusive clubs designed for a very, very small group of people. And this was it, the Latin Grammar School. Its purpose was incredibly simple and direct. Take the sons of the colonial elite and funnel them straight into leadership roles. It was basically a pipeline to colleges like Harvard to create the next generation of ministers and colonial leaders. This was not education for everyone. It was a finishing school for the ruling class.
And what's really fascinating is just how specific this model was. The first one pops up in Boston way back in 1635. The curriculum? It was laser-focused on Latin, Greek, and the classics. This was so important that a law in 1647 actually mandated that towns create them. But here's the massive problem. This system created a huge social divide. If you were a girl, or poor, or not destined for Harvard, this system offered you absolutely nothing.
But that huge educational gap, well, it didn't go unnoticed. A new, much more practical vision for what a school could be was about to emerge, and it was championed by one of America's most famous innovators. Yep, Benjamin Franklin. He looked at the Latin Grammar School and saw an institution that was just stuck in the past, totally out of step with a growing commercial nation. So he proposed something revolutionary, an academy. His vision was for a school that taught practical, real-world skills, not just ancient texts from thousands of years ago. And wow, the difference was just night and day. Where the Latin school was all about the classics, Franklin's Academy offered a choice. Sure, you could still study Latin if you wanted, but you could also learn math or bookkeeping or navigation, the skills you'd actually need to run a business or sail a ship. It was a big step forward, for sure. But there was still one major barrier: tuition. It was progress, yeah, but it still wasn't public education. So here's the crucial point. We still haven't gotten to the public high school. That took a whole different kind of revolution, a philosophical one. It was this radical new idea that secondary education was a right for all citizens and a responsibility of the state. And this is a name you absolutely need to know in this story: Horace Mann. As a leader of what was called the Common School movement in the mid-1800s, he argued passionately that a democracy needs educated citizens to survive. Now, his focus was mostly on elementary schools, creating a common experience for all kids, but his philosophy totally laid the groundwork for extending that idea up to high school. And the idea did start to take hold. The very first public high school opened its doors in Boston all the way back in 1821. It was seen as the next logical step up from the common elementary school. But just because these schools existed didn't mean they spread like wildfire. A massive fight was brewing just beneath the surface. The entire movement, the whole thing, hinged on this one question. People were literally arguing, why should my tax dollars pay for someone else's kid to go to high school? For a lot of folks, high school was seen as a private luxury, not a public necessity. And this single debate, it stalled the growth of public high schools for decades. The stalemate was finally broken by a single court case in Michigan, of all places. In 1874, the Kalamazoo case delivered a landmark ruling. It said that states could legally use taxpayer money for public high schools. This was it. This was the green light everyone had been waiting for. The legal barrier was shattered, and the path was finally clear for the public high school to become a truly American institution. Okay, so with the funding finally secured, high schools started popping up all over the country. But as the system grew, a new problem became really clear. The structure itself just wasn't quite right. See, the original model was usually an 8-year elementary school followed by a 4-year high school. But educators started realizing that young teenagers, 12, 13, 14-year-olds, they're in this really unique developmental stage. They're caught right between being a kid and being a young adult, and they needed a different kind of environment. So the solution was to build a bridge. In 1909, the very first junior high school was established, creating a separate space for grades 7, 8, and 9. Then, later in the 20th century, that idea was refined even more into the middle school model that we're probably more familiar with today, usually grouping grades 6 through 8 to create an even more tailored experience for preteens. So when you look at the whole journey, you see this really clear pattern. We went from this super exclusive elite model with the Latin grammar school to a more practical but still private one with the academy. The biggest jump, of course, was creating a tax-supported public system. And the final piece of the puzzle was refining that system to meet the specific needs of younger teens with junior high and middle school. Every single step was about opening the doors just a little wider for more people. This timeline really puts the long, long struggle into perspective. From that first elite school in 1635, it took almost 250 years of debate and innovation and legal battles to finally secure the idea of a public high school for all. It wasn't until 1909, with the creation of the junior high, that the basic structure we recognize today was finally in place. And that brings us right here to the present. Every single stage of this evolution was a response to the needs of the time, from training ministers to preparing citizens and factory workers for an industrial nation. So it really makes you wonder, in our incredibly fast-paced, digital, global world, is the institution we inherited from all these past eras still the right one to prepare us for the future?